On my 70th birthday, right as the candles smoked and the smell of warm cider filled the room, my grandson muttered, "Time to leave," while my daughter nodded toward a stack of papers. I'm Thad Rowan, a retired accountant. Fingers still brushing the smooth edge of a brass key in my pocket. Ever had a celebration turn into a crossroads you never saw coming? It was supposed to feel like a celebration, the kind of milestone where laughter and familiar scents fill the house, and I could almost forget the slow march of years. My cedar-shingled colonial had been scrubbed and polished, candles flickering against the old oak beams, the scent of baked apples and cinnamon wafting from the kitchen. Outside, the October wind teased the maples, swirling their red and amber leaves across the yard. Inside, glasses clinked, voices overlapped, and I sat by the hearth smiling politely as Karis and Lowell guided the evening's cheer with the ease of people who believe they're in control of every moment. I felt like a guest in my own home, watching the walls I had painted and repaired with Eleanor, now filled with the hum of people who saw me as something fragile, something temporary. The toast began warmly enough, Karis recalling how I used to measure Silas against the doorframe every summer. Roger from across the street offering a rambling story about the time I lent him my lawnmower when his died. Even Lowell, who rarely softened, told a forced joke about my obsession with balancing the household ledger, earning a few chuckles. But the warmth thinned quickly. Lowell's tone shifted as he tapped the rim of his whiskey glass fingers, drumming with the rhythm of someone about to take charge. "We've been thinking a lot about Dad's next chapter," he said, standing a little too squarely, his shoulders tight under his pressed gray jacket. Responsible next steps, making sure everyone can rest easy, knowing he's cared for. Autumn Days has excellent reviews, medical staff, scheduled meals, the works. The room moments ago bubbling with chatter fell oddly still. Even the old clock on the mantel seemed louder, ticking away, as if to remind me my time was being counted. Then, like a pin dropping into water, Silas's voice cut through. "Time to leave," he muttered, not even looking up from his phone before realizing the silence he'd pierced. His head jerked up, eyes wide with regret, a flush creeping up his neck. The laughter died altogether, replaced by a brittle quiet. Lowell cleared his throat, tried to smooth the edges. "What Silas means is change can be good. A fresh environment, professional care. It's the responsible thing." He smiled thinly, glancing toward Karis for reinforcement. She nodded, lips pressed into a line, her navy dress catching the low amber light of the dining room. I didn't speak. The taste of cinnamon on the air had turned acrid, as if someone had left the apples to burn just long enough to ruin the pie. I lifted my wine glass instead, swirling the liquid slowly, buying myself time to keep my face composed, while my chest tightened with something hotter than age or weariness. Across the room near the buffet where the apple crumble waited, I caught sight of Malcolm Quillen. We'd met briefly at a retirement finance seminar months back. His suit was as sharp now as it had been then, dark charcoal, with a muted burgundy tie, a contrast to the domestic clutter around him. He hadn't spoken a word all evening, not even to join the obligatory toasts, but now his hand moved smoothly, almost unnoticed, leaving a small cream-colored business card beside my half-empty glass. The candlelight caught its glossy edge. A glint that lingered even as he straightened gave me the faintest nod and slipped out through the side door without a word. No one else seemed to notice. I watched him go, the faint click of the latch vanishing beneath the hum of Lowell's continued pitch about transition plans and responsible choices. Karis leaned in close when the chatter returned in stilted waves, her hand light on my forearm. Her voice, so much like her mother's in timbre, lacked the softness Eleanor carried. "Dad, this will be easier for everyone if you just cooperate," she whispered. Her breath warm, but her tone clipped like she'd rehearsed it. I nodded slightly, not out of agreement, but to avoid a scene in front of the neighbors, feeling every fiber of the house around me. A house I had built, paid for, and patched through storms, shift further out of my grasp. The beams seemed heavier, the oak floor colder beneath my feet, as if the home itself were already pulling away. Later, when the plates had been cleared, and the polite laughter had settled into murmured goodbyes, I found myself alone in the kitchen. The party sounds faded to the distant murmur of cars on the street and the occasional creak of the old porch. The October wind pushed against the windows, making the candle flames waver. I stood by the window, staring at the yard, where the last of the maple leaves skittered across the stone path and slid Malcolm's card into my pocket. The porch door creaked behind me, a gust slipping through the frame, and the maples outside hissed and shivered under the night wind. I closed my eyes briefly, fingers tracing the embossed letters on the card through the fabric of my coat. Whatever came next, the night had made one thing clear in this house. At least I was no longer the master, just the relic they were politely preparing to archive. The shutters on my old house were still painted the deep green. Eleanor had chosen their color sharp against the white clapboards as we pulled away. The car's tires crunched over the gravel drive, and I caught one last glimpse of the gable window where I used to watch thunderstorms roll in over the harbor. The ride to Autumn Days was silent except for Lowell's thumb tapping on his phone and the faint hum of the heater. Kara sat beside him in the front, clutching the strap of her handbag, so tightly her knuckles looked bleached. No one looked back at me, not even when we turned down the long stretch of road that led to the single-story, brick facility they'd selected as my new home. I didn't ask any questions. The taste of morning coffee still lingered on my tongue, stale and bitter, but I kept my mouth closed. Words seemed useless when every decision had already been made for me. The building itself looked more like a neglected school than a place to live. Dull red bricks, windows clouded with condensation, a crooked sign out front with its paint peeling around the edges. Inside, the corridors were washed in pale light that hummed faintly from fluorescent tubes overhead. The air carried a stale mix of disinfectant and overcooked peas, a smell that clung to the back of my throat and made me wish for the faint scent of wood smoke from my fireplace back home. Nurses in scrubs moved briskly, but without urgency, their faces neutral, eyes avoiding contact with residents who shuffled down the hall or sat slumped in vinyl armchairs staring at muted televisions. I passed Henry, who didn't look up from the chessboard he never touched, and Edward, who whispered half-remembered lessons from his teaching days, to no one in particular. Roger, the only one whose eyes met mine, scowled, as if my arrival had personally inconvenienced him. My room was a box painted a pale green that might have been meant to soothe, but instead reminded me of a hospital ward. A single window overlooked the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, where a neon sign buzzed half-heartedly, its pink and blue tubes flickering in uneven rhythm. The furniture was sparse and functional, a narrow bed, a metal-framed chair, a closet with a single loose hinge. I set my suitcase on the chair, not bothering to unpack. The mattress squeaked when I sat, springs creaking like an old door, and I stared at the wall, tracing the faint outlines of patched holes where someone else's memories had been stripped away. On my way back from the cafeteria that afternoon, where lunch had been a slab of overcooked fish and mashed potatoes that tasted more like paste than food, I slowed as I passed the reception office. The door was open just enough for voices to leak out. Lowell's smooth tone carried easily edged with that false courtesy he used when he thought someone might be listening. "The basic package is fine," he told the administrator, his voice dropping a notch. "The less we spend now, the more will be left later." I caught the rustle of paper as he folded a printout and slipped it into his coat pocket cuff, brushing against the fabric with a whisper. There was a pause, a low murmur from the administrator, and then the scrape of Lowell's chair as he stood. I kept walking, my pace steady, eyes forward. My pulse, though, had quickened not from surprise, but from recognition. It was never about care. It was about balance sheets, about squeezing the most out of the ledger before the ink dried. Dinner was no better. The cafeteria was dim, the overhead lights buzzing, as if they too were exhausted. Roger sat across from me, prodding at a lump of congealed mashed potatoes with the back of his fork. He leaned forward, his breath carrying a faint trace of onions, and muttered without looking up, "You'll either get used to this place, or you won't last long." His tone wasn't cruel, just flat, as if he were reciting a fact rather than delivering a warning. Henry coughed softly beside him, never looking away from the empty chessboard in front of him, and Edward murmured something about the Boston Tea Party, under his breath, lost in his own fading timeline. When the trays were cleared and the hallways dimmed to that perpetual twilight glow, I found myself back in my room, perched on the edge of the squeaky mattress, staring out at the flickering neon sign. The parking lot was empty, save for a lone sedan with a missing hubcap, its headlights briefly catching the sheen of the wet pavement as it pulled away. The hum of the light outside filled the silence, a mechanical heartbeat that reminded me how far from home I really was. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the smooth edge of Malcolm's card, my thumb tracing the embossed letters as I turned it over. The gust outside rattled the thin window pane, the chill seeping through the glass. I sat there for a long while, card in hand, watching the neon flicker and thinking, as the wind hissed against the bricks, that maybe I wasn't quite finished yet. The coffee machine hissed like it was breathing its last, spitting a thin stream of liquid into a paper cup that barely smelled like coffee. I stood there, one hand braced on the counter for balance, watching the watery brew swirl and sighing at the thought of another bitter mouthful. The neon light above flickered and buzzed, casting a faint pink hue over the chipped counter. Behind me, footsteps paused. A calm, confident voice said, "Let me help you with that." I turned and there was Malcolm Quillen, the same sharp-suited figure I'd spotted at my birthday, now oddly out of place among the peeling paint and musty air of autumn days. His suit was charcoal, perfectly pressed, and the burgundy tie at his collar looked like it had never known a stain. He pressed a sequence of buttons on the machine with practiced ease. The stream darkened, smelling a little closer to actual coffee. He poured it into a fresh cup and handed it over his hand, steady and warm. "This place can't even get caffeine right," he murmured with a faint smile, his eyes flicking toward the hallway, where a nurse pushed a cart of rattling pill bottles. The common room around us buzzed with that peculiar kind of inertia. A muted game show played on a television bolted to the wall, its contestants shouting silently as the volume sat just above a whisper. The smell of old upholstery and reheated food clung to the air. Residents hunched over puzzle books or stared out the smeared windows, the rain outside tracing long streaks down the glass. Malcolm gestured toward a quiet corner table away from the traffic of staff, who passed with clipped nods, careful to keep moving so no one stopped them to complain about the food or the heat. I followed, cradling the paper cup in my palms, letting the warmth seep into fingers that still stiffened in the mornings. He slid into the chair opposite me, posture straight, his eyes scanning the room in a way that made me wonder if he was assessing more than just the peeling paint and drooping curtains. We started with small talk. He asked about my years before autumn days, and I found myself talking despite my initial caution. My career balancing ledgers for companies that couldn't keep their numbers straight, the nights I spent fixing pipes in the house because Eleanor wanted to save the plumber's fee, the quiet routines that had made me feel in control even as my body began to falter. He listened without interrupting his attention, sharp hands folded neatly on the table. At one point, he drew a notepad from his inner pocket and idly tapped a pen against the margin. On the open page, I caught glimpses of faint outlines, floor plans, notes about GH, and contract options. But he closed it gently when he noticed my glance, his smile returning as if to assure me it wasn't my concern. For now. After a pause, he reached into his jacket again and produced the same cream-colored card he'd left by my glass at the party. He placed it on the table between us, fingers resting on it lightly for a moment. "If you want options," he said in a low voice, glancing toward the passing nurse to ensure we weren't overheard, "call me. Golden Harbor isn't just rumor. It's a place where men like you live, not just wait." The words lingered, filling the gap left by the drone of the game show and the faint hum of the neon above us. My thumb traced the rim of the coffee cup, feeling the heat seep into my skin. While my mind sifted through the meaning of his offer, I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I watched the steam rise from the cup, curling and disappearing into the dim light, the quiet sound of rain against the window growing louder in the pause. Malcolm leaned in slightly, his voice soft enough that only I could hear. "You're not out of moves, Thad. Not yet." His gaze didn't waver, steady and calm, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than resignation stirring in my chest. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet. But it was the echo of the part of me that used to find solutions where there seemed to be none. He straightened, tucking the notepad back into his inner pocket, and stood smoothing the line of his jacket. "Think about it," he said, quietly, nodding once before walking toward the exit, his polished shoes making almost no sound against the scuffed linoleum floor. When he was gone, I sat there for a while, the card lying between my hands, the faint scent of the darkened coffee rising as the rain outside intensified. The parking lot beyond the smeared windows was slick and reflective neon signs from a distant gas station shimmering in the puddles like broken glass. I pocketed the card again this time. Deliberately, my thumb brushing the embossed letters through the fabric. Outside, a gust of wind pushed against the windows, and I watched the rain ripple across the lot, imagining a place where the lights didn't flicker and the coffee didn't taste like boiled water. The machine hissed again behind me as another resident fumbled with it, and I felt the corner of my mouth twitch into something close to a smile. There might still be a way out of this place, and I wasn't ready to fade into the pale green walls just yet. Lowell didn't bother knocking. The lounge door creaked open with a screech, and the gray afternoon light spilling through the cracked window barely softened the sharp lines of his face. He strode in with the clipped pace of a man who wanted everyone to know he was in control. Before I could shift the chipped teacup closer to safety, he slammed Malcolm's cream-colored business card down on the table so hard it tipped the cup, spilling lukewarm tea in a thin stream across the scarred wood. The liquid dripped lazily to the floor, pooling near the leg of my chair. "You're a senile old man chasing pipe dreams." He snapped, his breath quick and uneven, the collar of his wrinkled coat sitting askew as if he'd dressed in anger. His eyes, pale and cold, bored into me, as though his glare alone could pull the fight out of my bones. Karis lingered near the door, one hand gripping the frame, as though it might steady her. She didn't speak, didn't even meet my eyes, but her gaze kept flickering toward Lowell's coat. A folded invoice protruded from his inside pocket. Its top edge crumpled the faint traces of smudged numbers barely visible under the lounge's dim light. She noticed. I saw her notice, though she said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the door frame, and her lips pressed together in a thin, unreadable line. Behind her, the muted voice of a weather reporter droned from the wall-mounted TV. Something about a coastal storm rolling in wind gusts, early snow. The draft from the cracked window frame carried a chill across my legs. A reminder of the season pressing forward outside these walls. Lowell's tirade continued, each word sharper than the last. "You think some lawyer with a shiny tie can swoop in and fix everything? You won't change a thing. We're in charge here. The accounts, the house, the care. You're here because you can't handle life out there anymore. Accept it." His hand pressed down on the card fingers, splayed like he wanted to pin it to the table permanently, as though his grip alone could stop whatever plan he imagined I was brewing. I let him talk. My hand stayed folded on my lap, my face impassive even as the faint stain of tea crept across the table's edge and dampened my sleeve. Each word he threw at me was a gust of wind. I'd already braced for another storm. I didn't need to meet head-on to weather. When his voice finally dropped into muttered curses, and the sound of his breathing filled the silence, I let my eyes drift not to him, but to that folded invoice in his coat. The corner of the paper caught the dim light, the smudged numbers like bruises on the page. Karis noticed again, her eyes flicking to me for just a heartbeat before dropping to the floor. Lowell didn't catch it. He yanked his coat tighter, shoved the card toward me one last time, and stalked toward the door. "We'll be back tomorrow. Don't waste your time with fantasies." The door thudded shut behind him, and Karis lingered a second longer, her mouth twitching as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Then she followed her footsteps soft against the worn carpet. The lounge grew still again. The TV muttered on about the approaching storm, its voice a dull hum. Outside, the rain had started streaking the window with uneven trails that caught what little light filtered through the heavy clouds. I wiped the tea from my sleeve with the corner of a napkin and pulled my battered laptop from beneath the chair. The plastic casing was scuffed, the hinge stiff from years of use. But when the screen flickered on and the cursor blinked against the dark background of my email draft, I felt a steadiness settle in my chest. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, listening to the faint drip of rain through the window frame before typing the words. "Ready to move." Roger shuffled by in the hall, his shoes dragging softly across the linoleum. He paused at the doorway, leaning slightly on his cane, his eyes glinting with something between mischief and approval. "Looks like the old man's got some fight left after all." He muttered, his voice low, but carrying in the quiet room. Without waiting for a reply, He continued down the hall, the tap of his cane fading into the hum of the TV. I clicked the send button, the soft ding of the outgoing email punctuating the moment. For a second, my reflection stared back from the darkened screen, the rain-streaked window beside me framing a silhouette that felt less like a relic and more like someone still holding the last pieces of his own story. Malcolm arrived at Autumn Days just as the wind began tugging the last crimson leaves from the maples along the drive. He didn't honk or wave, just stepped from a slate-gray sedan and gave me a calm nod. His gloved hand opening the passenger door as if this were just another business trip. I slipped into the seat, the chill from the cracked lounge window still lingering in my coat. We pulled away in silence, the tires hissing over damp asphalt, as we wound along the coastal roads toward Salem's edge. The Atlantic flashed through breaks in the trees, whitecaps catching the pale light, the salt air seeping faintly through the vents. Neither of us spoke for several miles, and I realized I was grateful for the quiet. The noise I'd been living with, Lowell's accusations, the shuffle of indifferent nurses, the TV's endless mutter seemed to fade behind the steady hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on the wet road. Golden Harbor rose from the fog like something out of a memory I hadn't realized I'd been keeping. The grounds were sprawling, the main building a mix of colonial architecture and modern glass, its windows glowing softly against the overcast sky. Pine trees lined the walkways, their scent mingling with the salt breeze from the coast. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and faint citrus, rather than antiseptic. Veronica Clark, a poised woman in her 40s, with a practiced smile that somehow didn't feel forced, met us in the lobby. "Welcome, Mr. Rowan," she said, her tone warm without the syrupy cadence I'd grown used to from the staff at Autumn Days. She offered tea in a china cup that actually held heat, not the paper-thin vessels I'd grown accustomed to, and led us through the wide sunlit corridors. The tour was more than a courtesy. It felt like a reminder of what life could still be. We passed a glass-walled library, the scent of paper and leather wafting out as a resident flipped through a thick hardcover. In a music room, someone's fingers traced the opening notes of a Chopin nocturne on a polished grand piano, the melody floating softly into the hall. The dining room set for the evening meal was dressed in linen and china crystal glasses, catching the dimmed lights like quiet stars. I walked behind Veronica and Malcolm, my hand trailing along a smooth oak banister, the sensation of something solid and cared for easing the tightness in my chest. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a burden to be stashed away. I felt cautiously like a person again, in a paneled conference room that smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. Richard Brighton, the director, slid a folder across the polished table toward me. His tone was brisk, but not cold as he explained the details. Malcolm sat beside me methodically reviewing each page, his pen tapping lightly before he initialed a margin here or there. The sound of the pen scratching across the documents combined with the distant echo of Chopin from somewhere down the hall made the moment feel heavier, grounded. I skimmed the final page before adding my signature, the weight of the pen comfortable in my hand. With those strokes, my Salem home and a portion of my savings were no longer just assets waiting to be divided. They were my ticket out of a life that had begun to feel like waiting for the end. Later in the temporary suite Veronica had arranged, I stood by the window, watching the ocean fade into dusk. The sky burned faintly orange as the sun slipped behind the horizon, the wind lifting the curtains and carrying the faint tang of salt through the room. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and tapped out a short message to Karis Inheritance, rewritten. Details later. My thumb hovered for a moment before pressing send. Then I powered the phone off and set it on the dresser, the room instantly quieter without its faint buzz. I stepped out onto the balcony, the air sharp but clean, my coat pulled close around me. Below the grounds were still the tops of the pines, swaying gently in the breeze, the faint glow from the lobby windows spilling out onto the walkways. For a long moment, I simply stood there, my hands tucked in my pockets, exhaling like I'd been holding my breath for months without realizing it. Behind me on the dresser, the phone began to vibrate violently once, twice, then over and over until the sound became a dull hum. I didn't turn. 27 missed calls or 200 wouldn't matter tonight. Instead, I kept my eyes on the dark line of the Atlantic, the steady movement of the waves, and let the phone buzz itself quiet, while the wind off the water cooled the heat, that had lived in my chest for far too long. Karis and Lowell stood in the lobby of Golden Harbor, like travelers who had landed in a world they didn't recognize. The overnight flight from Europe clung to their faces. Pale, skin-swollen eyes, the tension in their shoulders, carried like extra luggage. Their stares bounced from the marble floors to the polished brass railings, the softly lit paintings on the walls, even the concierge's quiet nod. This wasn't autumn days, with its scuffed linoleum and faint smell of boiled vegetables. It unsettled them, though neither said so aloud. I could see it in the way Lowell's jaw tightened as he straightened his coat, scanning the lobby, as if the grandeur itself were some affront he needed to counter. Upstairs, the pale oak floors of my studio creaked gently under my shoes as I crossed to the frosted window. The rose garden below was sheathed in a delicate crust of ice, each stem glinting faintly, where the winter sun broke through the clouds. A piano somewhere down the hall murmured through a soft melody. Chopin again, or something close. I stood straight, my hands clasped lightly behind me, no tremor in my stance, waiting as their voices and footsteps approached. When the knock came sharp but hesitant, I didn't rush. I turned the brass handle, slowly opening the door to their drawn faces, and the faint smell of airplane coffee still clinging to their coats. "Come in," I said evenly, stepping aside. They hesitated only a second before entering, their eyes flicking from the pale wood to the neatly arranged books on my shelf, the sunlight warming the linen on the small dining table. Lowell's fingers tapped against his thigh, restless. Karis clutched her scarf as though the knit might anchor her. Neither sat until I gestured toward the two chairs across from the low table. I remained standing. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I overheard you both at Autumn Days." I began, my voice measured steady, the basic package conversation, and I saw the invoices Lowell folded away with the numbers scrubbed out. The words hung there, unembellished, the faint piano notes filling the pause. Karis's eyes dropped to her lap. Lowell's jaw tightened further, his fingers now drumming lightly on the arm of the chair. "You were planning your comfort," I continued, "not mine." Lowell leaned forward, his tone clipped. "You can't just give away the house and the savings to some facility. We have rights. We'll take this to court if we have to." He sounded certain, but the way his gaze flicked toward the window betrayed the strain behind it. Before I could reply, the door opened softly and Malcolm stepped in his presence, as calm as the low hum of the piano in the distance. Without a word, he crossed to me and placed a cool, gleaming brass key into my palm, the weight of it grounding me. "It's all yours now," he said quietly, just loud enough for them to hear. His other hand rested on the folder, tucked beneath his arm. Lowell's eyes snapped to that folder like a hawk. Malcolm met his stare evenly, before setting the folder on the table, opening it to reveal the independent capacity examination, notarized statements, and the contracts bearing my signature. His voice stayed even, devoid of triumph. "Mr. Rowan is fully competent. The guardianship you hold is limited to certain medical decisions. Financially, he is free and clear, and these agreements are airtight. A challenge would not only fail, but complicate matters for you both." His tone didn't rise, but the implication was clear. Lowell's tapping fingers stilled against the folder's edge, his mouth pressing into a thin, hard line. I broke the silence. "It's my money, my life. No more strings, no more waiting. You don't have to like it, but you will respect it." I let the quiet return after that, the piano's notes drifting into the stillness, a faint gust rattling the frosted window, as if to punctuate the line I had drawn. Karis's face softened the conflict plain as she glanced at me. Her voice, when it came, was little more than a whisper. "Maybe we just needed to hear it this way." Her fingers loosened on the scarf. Lowell rose first, stiff-backed, his silence heavy as he moved toward the door. Karis lingered for a beat longer, her eyes sweeping the room once more. Not with envy, but something closer to reluctant understanding before she followed him out. The door clicked shut, leaving only the fading piano melody and the faint sheen of frost beyond the window. I turned the brass key over in my hand, feeling its weight before setting it on the table beside Malcolm's folder. The garden below caught a rare glint of sunlight, the ice on the roses flashing briefly like glass before the clouds reclaimed the sky. The meeting room in Golden Harbor's west wing glowed with a soft winter light, the sun slipping through the frosted windows in long, gentle stripes that stretched across the polished oak table. Outside, rain began to tap lightly on the glass, a rhythmic murmur against the quiet warmth inside. The smell of brewed tea mixed with the faint tang of varnish, the kind of scent that carried a calm weight like the halls of an old library. I sat at the head of the table, a pen resting lightly between my fingers. As I looked at the papers laid out before me, the pledge for the Golden Harbor Cultural Fund, my name was typed neatly across the top. A strange sight, after months of feeling more like a line item in someone else's ledger than a man capable of shaping something new. Donald Prescott sat opposite me, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his eyes still bright beneath a thatch of silver hair. He lifted his chipped mug of tea carefully, the yellow tape wrapping its crack, glowing softly in the winter light. "Even broken things can hold something worthwhile," he murmured, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hand. The words floated across the table, settling into the quiet in a way that felt less like comfort and more like truth. Veronica Clark, seated to my right, glanced at him with a faint smile as she continued sketching ideas for the fund on her notepad. Art workshops, music nights, community lectures. Her pen scratched softly, the sound blending with the light tap of rain and the faint hum of heating vents. Malcolm, calm as ever, stood at the far end of the table, reviewing the legal framework he'd prepared. The folder in his hand was neatly organized tabs, marking out contingencies and approvals. He glanced up once, meeting my eye with a quiet nod before returning to his review. His presence, steady and deliberate, grounded the moment. This wasn't about defiance anymore, or even victory. It was about channeling the freedom I had fought for into something that might outlast the bitterness I'd carried. I signed the pledge with a slow, even stroke, the pen gliding smoothly, as if my hand had been waiting for this act to release something clenched inside me. When the papers were collected and Veronica began discussing the first workshop dates, my phone buzzed softly in my coat pocket. I pulled it free, the screen lighting up the room's dimmer corner with the glow of a single-line email. "Sorry for what I said. Hope you're okay, Grandpa." Silas's name sat above it, the awkwardness of his apology fitting the boy. I remembered quick to speak slower, to mend. For a long moment, I just stared at the words, the faint reflection of my face on the screen, making it feel like a bridge between two worlds. Then, without overthinking it, I forwarded the email to Karis with a brief note. "Tell him I'm fine. No lecture, no reprimand. Just enough." Donald tapped the rim of his chipped mug lightly, the yellow tape catching the light as his fingers drummed once, twice. "Second act's Thad." He set, his mouth curving into a faint smile. "Not everyone gets them." I met his gaze, letting the weight of the words settle in the space between us. The mug, battered but functional, sat like a small emblem on the table, a reminder that some things once fractured could still hold more than they once did. As the rain picked up, drumming softly against the frosted glass, I drew a fresh card from my leather folio. The cardstock was thick, its surface cool beneath my fingertips. I uncapped my pen and began to write slowly, the ink soaking into the fibers with a deliberate weight. It was an invitation addressed to Karis and Silas for the winter music evening we had planned as the Cultural Fund's first event. Each stroke of the pen felt steady, not rushed or hesitant, the kind of writing done by someone no longer looking over his shoulder. Outside, the garden paths blurred through the rain-streaked window, the world softened by the drizzle. I signed my name at the bottom of the card, set the pen down, and let my hand rest flat on the paper, feeling its quiet permanence as the muted hum of Golden Harbor wrapped around me. The music hall at Golden Harbor glowed with a quiet warmth, the kind that only candlelight and soft piano can create. Snow sifted down beyond the tall windows, each flake catching in the faint glow of the street lamps before settling into the growing blanket on the garden paths. Inside, the vaulted ceiling and dark wooden beams felt like the rafters of an old church, steady and familiar. The scent of pine garlands draped along the hall's edges mixed with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee, grounding the room against the chill that clung to December's edges. Donald Prescott stood at the front, his hands steady despite their age as he held his worn poetry notebook, the cream pages fanning softly in the flicker of candlelight. His voice, low and measured, drifted through the hall, words about winter light and second chances, threading gently through the murmurs of the audience. I sat in the second row, a steaming cup of coffee cradled between my palms. Its warmth seeped into my fingers, a small anchoring comfort. On the side table next to my chair, the framed card Malcolm had first slipped me weeks ago leaned against a small taped mug, its yellow seam bright against the deep grain of the wood. The brass key he'd given me rested beside them, its polished surface catching the glow of the candles whenever someone passed. They weren't trophies, not in the way some people might see them, but markers. Pieces of a path that had felt broken, now stitched into something whole enough to hold the weight of nights like this. Malcolm stood near the back of the hall, half-shadowed, his posture as unshakable as always. His faint smile was hard to read approval, maybe, or simply quiet recognition, but he didn't need to speak. His nod, slow and deliberate when our eyes met, was enough. The room didn't need his voice tonight. It already had Donald's and the soft melody rising from the piano, tucked into the corner, a nocturne curling through the air like a living thread. The combination of words and music seemed to settle over everyone, even the restless, even the ones who still shifted in their seats out of habit. Kara sat beside me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her scarf draped across her knees. Her eyes, reflecting the warm flicker of the candles, wandered over the hall before settling on me. She spoke softly, almost hesitantly, as Donald turned a page in his notebook. "Mom would have liked this," she said. "The music, the quiet. It feels like Christmas used to feel." Her voice didn't carry regret, not entirely, but something close to it, a memory brushed with both comfort and distance. I nodded, sipping from my cup, letting the rich bitterness of the coffee coat my tongue before I spoke. She would have, I agreed, my gaze, following the swirl of snow outside the windows. The candles reflected faintly against the glass, softening the world beyond the hall. Silas shifted slightly in his seat on my other side, his gaze fixed on the pianist's hands as the melody deepened. He cleared his throat once, then leaned closer, his words so low they were nearly lost in the music. "I didn't mean it, Grandpa." Back then, I wasn't thinking. The awkwardness in his tone was a weight of its own, heavier than the simple words. I let the music swell for a moment before answering, my voice just as soft. "It's not about inheritance anymore," I said. "It's about living while we can. All of us." He didn't respond right away, but I felt the subtle release in his shoulders, the tension loosening as the final lines of Donald's poem met the first quiet chords of the next piece. As the piano carried its final notes, the candlelight caught briefly on the brass key and the taped mug, their reflections glinting against the dark wood like small constellations. The room fell silent for a breath, the air holding the last vibrations of the nocturne before the soft shuffle of chairs signaled the end of the evening's program. I stayed seated, letting the others rise and mingle, my hands wrapped around the coffee cup, feeling its heat steady against my skin. Through the window, the snow had thickened, falling in soft, lazy spirals, blurring the lights beyond the garden and covering the walkways until they seemed to vanish into the night. I closed my eyes briefly, not from fatigue, but from something closer to contentment. The warmth of the cup seeped deeper into my hands, the faint hum of conversation drifting past like a tide I no longer needed to fight against. Here in this hall, with its flickering light and snow-dimmed windows, I wasn't a relic or a burden or a ledger waiting to be settled. I was simply myself, anchored whole and at last my own man. The snow kept falling that night, soft and steady, as the warm glow from the music hall spilled over the frosted windows. I held the taped mug in one hand, the framed card and brass key resting beside it, no longer reminders of struggle, but of what had been mended. I realized then that survival isn't just about winning a fight. It's about finding a way to build something gentle in the space after. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. For anyone facing a loss, be it a job, a marriage, or a home, there's still room to create a new chapter. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?